Today, we're going to talk about liberals. So, American liberalism was born from our experiences in both the Great Depression and the Second World War. What did we learn in both of those things? Well, in the Second World War, we learned that fascism, communism, the totalitarian systems of government pretty much suck. During the Great Depression, we learned that classical liberalism, with its emphasis on deregulation of the economy, might deregulate your economy so it drives off the edge of a cliff. So you need some brakes, you need some regulations if you're going to have a modern industrial economy, and American liberalisms are much more ready to regulate the economy, almost to the extent that some might accuse them of engaging in socialistic economic measures. Remember, FDR himself was sort of accused of that during the Great Depression. But World War II showed the failures of fascism in general, and especially in Europe, there's an increase in democratic interest in social reforms. So, for example, Italy, which is the birthplace of modern day fascism, becomes a constitutional democracy. And even Spain, which was a fascist state after the Spanish Civil War, voluntarily go through a democratic transformation after the death of fascist dictator Francisco Franco. But there's a consensus that even though individual rights and individual liberties are a good thing in liberalism, what's different between classical liberalism and this modern version of liberalism is, of course, greater regulation of the economy and a greater role for the government in managing the economy. So after World War II, there's a consensus that the welfare state works. So in Western Europe especially, you see a movement towards welfare states in 1948. These are incredibly expensive and they rely upon high taxation. Even in the United States, which has never been as comfortable with welfare as Western Europe, you still see a maintenance of what were supposed to be temporary policies like Social Security. And in fact, Social Security and great, New Deal style policies get expanded by Harry Truman to include things like federal minimum wage laws. Now, liberalism is something that's mostly concentrated in Western Europe and the United States, but it even extends, at least in a tepid form, into the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union, because in 1975, the United States and the Soviet Union broker what is called the Helsinki Accords. So what happens is that the United States agrees to recognize the legitimacy and the legality of these sort of communist states in Eastern Europe, and in exchange, the Soviet Union recognizes the principle of self-determination. What is kind of interesting about this is that the Soviet Union sort of feels like they're getting something for free without giving away anything in exchange. So the West recognizes their territory, and in exchange, they have to pay lip service to self-determination. But in reality, this is a huge deal because what the Soviet Union sort of fails to realize is that the people who are watching and listening to this are ordinary Soviet and Eastern European citizens that take the idea of self-determination very, very seriously. Now, during the Second World War, as you well know, the Nazis commit one of the worst crimes ever in human history, the Holocaust, which kills over 11 to 12 million people in total, including 6 million Jews. The rest of the world looks on in horror and revulsion at what has happened, and you can pick up on that horror and revulsion in the founding documents of the United Nations that enshrine things like human rights and liberties. So the United States, after the Second World War, kind of becomes the nation that is most concerned with ensuring that something like the Holocaust never happens again. It sort of becomes the torchbearer of the idea of human rights and liberties. The issue is every time the United States lectures the Soviet Union on, for example, how it treated Hungarians in the 1956 Orange Revolution, the response was always, oh yeah? Well, why don't we talk about how you treat your black people. And to a certain extent, they're right, because the United States still practiced a form of segregation called Jim Crow, in which there are two separate worlds for white and black people. So arguably, this makes the United States, at least at the national level, much more sensitive to issues surrounding race and civil rights. Also, after World War II, you have an entire generation of black soldiers who face down the Nazis down the side of a gun barrel and come out, alive and victorious. So you can kind of imagine that if you've stared down and fought the Nazis, then standing up to Southern sheriffs trying to enforce Jim Crow laws actually seems comparatively like a breeze. So all of these factors kind of merge together and help create the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. What gives it a foundation, the other thing that gives it a foundation is in 1954, the legal justification for Jim Crow laws is struck down in the Supreme Court decision Brown versus Board of Education. This starts sort of this avalanche of other challenges to segregationist laws. And this is where Martin Luther King and his civil disobedience campaign comes in. So many of you are already familiar with the story of Rosa Parks and the civil disobedience campaign that's waged against the Montgomery city buses, where Rosa Parks deliberately boards a bus, refuses to give up her seat to a white passenger, and, as I said, deliberately gets arrested. The idea of civil disobedience is, remember, if there's an unjust law, you demonstrate how unjust it is by forcing law enforcement to go through the process of enforcing the law. So Rosa Parks is arrested. This becomes the sort of the scenario or the situation that leads to a broader boycott of the Montgomery City buses, and the city of Montgomery ultimately caves. So this causes Martin Luther King's movement to grow in size, and then eventually, thanks to the attention that King brings to the issue of civil rights around the country, the United States Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, both of which are intended to give black and people of color equal rights. Now, Martin Luther King was truly a radical in some ways because he had this vision of a racially inclusive society where people were treated equally on the basis of race during a time period where that was almost a fantasy. Not everybody shared his same vision, however. Malcolm X, the leader of the Nation of Islam, for example, believed that, essentially, at least he believed at a certain point in his life, that the situation between white and black people had basically become toxic, and the only thing there was to do is for black people to basically go and found their own society, and in some cases to use violence to protect themselves. You also see ideas of black empowerment, but also black nationalism in the emergence of the Black Power movement that criticized Martin Luther King's accommodationist and more peaceful approach. Finally, and as a reaction to industrialization and also as a reaction to the publication of Silent Springs by Rachel Carson in 1962, you see a growing focus on environmental issues, especially over issues revolving around things like pesticides and the release of pollutants into the atmosphere. So in the 1970s, you have the creation of green movements, especially in Western Europe, but even in the United States to a certain extent. In places like Germany, for instance, you have parties that are fairly substantial that call themselves the Green Party, where environmentalism is kind of front and center of their political platform. It's no secret that the 20th century is known as the U.S. century just because of the sheer economic and cultural dominance exerted by the United States. The other reason it's the U.S. century is because the United States basically reinvents itself as the world's leading defender of both democracy and capitalism. Now, sometimes in defense of democracy and capitalism, the United States can be said to overreact quite a bit. This is, of course, referring to this time period in the early 1950s known as the Red Scare, in which everybody is terrified of communism. And no, this is not a Fallout reference. People were legitimately terrified of communism. And one of the reasons that people were terrified of communism is the public trial of Alger Hiss before the House of Un-American Activities Committee. So Alger Hiss wasn't just any communist spy. He was the personal aide of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It was considered one of the leading architects of the United Nations. The idea that somebody like Alger Hiss could be a communist spy was frankly ridiculous. And then cross-examiner Richard Nixon basically exposes Alger Hiss as a communist before the committee. And everybody goes ballistic, because if the personal aide of the President of the United States could be a communist, then the question is, who else could be a communist? This starts the intense scrutinizing of communism or people who were suspected of having communist sympathies in public. This would also include major authors, Hollywood actors, etc., many of whom were unable to find work because they were placed on an anti-communist blacklist circulated by lots of major movie studios. You've already talked about the fact that communism was kind of seen like a disease. And so if you're going to fight a disease, you need a cure, and you, of course, need quarantining until you get that cure. So this is formalized in the Truman Doctrine in 1947. This comes on the heels of a civil war in Greece, in which there is a communist faction that is fighting the Greek government in exile. The communist faction is armed by the Soviet Union. The British are supporting the not necessarily the democratic government of Greece, but basically the non-communist government of Greece. And the British basically realized that they broke. So they go to the United States government and basically ask it to take on its role as the world's leading anti-communist power. The United States agrees to this, and they basically throw tons of money and military assistance at the problem. But, because of this influx of U.S. aid, the communist faction in the Greek Civil War ends up absolutely collapsing. The idea of containment, of course, is that if communism exists anywhere, then it can exist everywhere. This is going to lead to what's called domino theory, where if one country becomes communist, others are going to follow. This leads to the policy of containment, which leads the United States to arrange alliances with countries that surround the USSR to prevent the spread of communism. Note that the United States is okay allying with democracies. It's also okay allying with military dictatorships, like, for example, Spain under Francisco Franco, who, remember, was an ideological ally of Adolf Hitler. While that was the case, the United States looks at Franco as being anti-communist, and that's good enough for them. It also leads the United States to supporting military overthrows of certain governments that don't seem anti-communist or seem pro-communist. This famously backfires when the communist government of Cuba, has an attempted overthrow by the United States government, which landed Cuban refugees at the Bay of Pigs, which did not go very well. Nothing to do with actual pigs, by the way. This policy of containment will lead the United States to fight and contain the USSR not only in Europe, but also on the battlefields of Korea and Vietnam. This, of course, means that U.S. defense spending is not really going to go down after World War II. In fact, U.S. defense spending stays very, very high, while also New Deal programs are still highly funded. This combination of military spending and welfare state spending is eventually going to cause lots of inflation in the United States starting in the 1970s. Later on, however, there is a period in the 1970s where the U.S. adopts détente, which is kind of known as this period of peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. In the United States and much of Western Europe, we also have the beginnings of this second wave of feminism. Remember, the first wave of feminism is in the late 19th, early 20th century, and we associate that with the push for suffrage. Now, in most of the Western world, women have the right to vote. The question is, do they really have equality? So remember, what happens in the Second World War is many women fill in the shoes of men who have gone off to fight in the war. Now, when the war ends, many of these women are expected to basically give up their jobs for the men. But, as it happens when people sort of start to make their own money, they tend to want to keep said money. And also, especially in the United States, your job can very much form the basis of your identity. I'm not sure that that's healthy either, but that's just kind of the way it is. But there was this push to get women back out of the workforce and for men to settle down and start families. You had a number of leading voices at the time, most notably Dr. Benjamin Spock, no relation to Star Trek, who argued that women should not work and should instead stay at the house or at the home to take care of the children. Partially out of reaction to all these pressures, you have the second wave of feminism. So, whereas the first wave is concerned with voting, the second wave is concerned more with social equality, including equal pay, access to divorce, abortion laws, birth control, daycare, and also women not being objectified as sex objects. So this actually is pretty significant because it leads to the decline of the overall birth rate in the 1960s with accessible birth control. You have the creation of organizations like the National Organization of Women that are designed to advocate for women's rights. And so by the 1970s, women had 44% of all the jobs in Western countries. And of course, the rise in divorce increases as families sort of get adjusted to the roles of working women. One thing to kind of mention there is one of the reasons for this is not just because of feminism, but also because in the 1970s, the really golden post-war economic boom starts to kind of atrophy. For many countries, especially the United States, if you were a single male, you could have a job that could pay for a house, a car, and by the way, I mean a house in the suburbs, and it could support multiple children and a wife that stays home with said children. Whether or not that idea or dream is something that you would want to pursue, the fact is by the 1970s, it becomes kind of unaffordable for many families and has remained unaffordable for most American and most Western European families ever since. So by the 1970s, with the second wave of feminism in full force, it emphasizes equality between men and women, downplays domestic roles for women, and advocated for women's sexual and reproductive rights. What's also interesting is that in countries like the United States, you also have this weird alliance between very, very progressive women and very, very conservative women, especially over the prevalence of obscenity and pornography. So one of the things that leads to the emergence of the second wave of feminism is this perception that progressive men were still sort of treating women as sex objects. They were still being overly sexualized and demeaned in that way. And what's interesting is that very, very progressive women objected to being sexualized, but also very, very conservative women also, protested this kind of objectification. So you have this joining of forces between very, very progressive women and very, very conservative women to fight the sexualization of women. The Pax Americana didn't just extend to American geopolitics, American military strength, or economic potential, it also extended to just American culture in general. So everywhere you look, American pop culture sort of reigns supreme. You have the prevalence of abstract expressionism. This is spontaneous, subconscious art making. And you have the popularization of pop artists. Who bridge the gap between art and mass culture. Think of Andy Warhol's Campbell soup cans or his portrait of Marilyn Monroe. In the early 1950s, as kind of a extension of jazz and swing music, we have the emergence of the crooners like Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, and Julie Garland. But eventually, by the 1950s, they're displaced by Elvis Presley's gyrating hips with the emergence of rock and roll. Rock and roll, by the way, is basically blues and jazz with an electric amplifier. So originally it's a form of black music. Elvis Presley is an acceptable white face for white audiences that basically accept him as this sort of pop culture, pop music legend. Rock and roll also becomes the music of identity and protest for the generation that's born immediately after World War II. And you also have the popularization of folk music, music festivals like Woodstock, and the emergence of the long-haired hippies. In Europe, you have what's called Coca-Colanization, which was called this because of the interest in pop culture of the United States. This is where U.S. soft drinks, blue jeans, chewing gum, TV, and Hollywood film became increasingly common, increasingly accessible, and increasingly displaced sort of native European culture to a certain extent, except in France. So that being said, European pop culture had its own power in the US. For example, in the 1960s, you have the Beatles' British invasion, where the rock group The Beatles sort of takes the country by storm, which would have been great for King George III to know that all he really had to do to subdue the colonies was to send 4 shaggy-haired Liverpudlians to the colonies, and that would shut them right up, or get them screaming in euphoria and ecstasy as the Beatles played Hey Jude. So that's it. The question is, liberalism seems like it coincides with the advances of many groups of people, this great economic boom period, the entrenchment of the welfare state. Well, what's the problem with it? Well, as we'll talk about next time, it's really expensive.